pressure looks good.
Following up. Roger, roll, Atlantic. Flight downside, speed off.
Yikes. You bet. Okay. We don't need any more of these.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of NASA Spaceflight Live. My name is Thomas Burghardt. I'm an editor, writer, reporter for NASA Spaceflight, and I'm joined by two of my greatest friends here today for this week's show. We're going to talk about a lot of this week's news in spaceflight and some cool stuff that's coming up. First and foremost, on my left, which is that way. Oh, I guessed it right the first time. Chris Gebhardt, a familiar face to the show, assistant managing editor for NASA Spaceflight. Chris, how are you doing?
I am doing absolutely great. How are you, Thomas?
I'm doing well, and to my right is a new face to the show, a very, very
Yeah.
special guest, Mr. John Kraus Photos. John, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so we brought another special guest. We want to talk about some of the cool stuff that's going on. Of course, as always, this show, it's interactive, it's live, so if you've got questions about what we're talking about, questions for us, please feel free to put them in the chat, and you can tag us with @NASASpaceflight. We'll bring those up, and we'll try to answer a bunch of those questions throughout the show. But in the meantime, we're just going to get right into some of the news that have come out this past week and talk about some really cool stuff going on. And because we've got John here, we should talk about one of, that rocket that, well, we only have photos from because of John. Astra Space got some news this week, so let's talk about them a little bit. Rocket 3 up in Kodiak, John. I'm going to just keep showing a bunch of John's photos. Yeah, you recognize these photos?
Yeah.
And the reason I want to talk about this is because they just got a couple launch contracts for NASA to launch 3 different missions on their Rocket 3 vehicle, this one you're seeing here. And they bought 3 launches for less than $8 million, which is absurd. But that's, of course, Astra's whole thing, is this really low cost and really frequent access to space. John, let's just get your take on this. How cool is it to go? I mean, you're kind of the one person who's seen Astra up close and personal and seen their launches up from Alaska. They've done 2 now, and they got really close to orbit last time. They're going to try and get it next time. But just what's that like, going up to Kodiak and seeing that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I have to do the typical disclaimer that I cannot speak officially on behalf of the company, but I can say that I take photos of Astra's launches for Astra, which means I get some really cool insight into the company's operations up in Kodiak. And I've been up there 4 times. The first was actually just about a year ago right now as a part of the DARPA launch challenge. But to see Astra attempt to launch to orbit twice this early on in their existence has been really cool. They have this very minimal launch architecture sort of angle on how they approach their flights. There's sort of a giant tent. There's a transporter erector that raises the rocket, and then they launch it with only a staff of about 5 people. So to see that up close and take their official imagery of their launches is really cool. And you can see one of the shots there from the December launch, which, as you said, was like I don't know if there's ever been an orbital launch that's been that close to reaching orbit. But they got really, really close, and this year they're gonna try to launch again to reach orbit with a customer. So it's gonna be really exciting.
So let's talk about this contract that they just won, focusing on this week in space news. The press release that you're saying they'll launch from one of their new sites, and because, like you mentioned, Astra can launch from a lot of different places because they just bring everything with them, right? So this next contract, NASA says, is going to launch from, I'm going to pronounce that, Kwajalein Atoll. I hope I got that close, right?
More or less, yeah.
Yeah,
Quaj
one of the
for short.
Yeah, Kwaj. I'm just going to call it Kwaj from now on. In the middle of the Pacific, where SpaceX Falcon 1 got their start, if you recognize the name from that. But 3 launches for less than $8 million. For comparison, a Falcon 9 starts out at it's anywhere, some different estimates are out there, but like 50 million-ish for a Falcon 9. Obviously, a completely different scale of rocket. But for 3 launches and less than 8 million, that seems ridiculous. But that's Astra's thing. They want to make the cost super, super low for these like small sat launchers, and there's a lot of these small sat companies out there. I'm going to yield this to Chris. Let's start with you. What do you see this kind of effect being for other small sat companies? We've got Rocket Lab in the mix, Virgin Orbit. We got Firefly coming up. There are more that I'm sure I'm not thinking of that are going to come out too.
A lot of them.
There's
Mhm.
a lot of them, and we talked to a lot of people. Like we talked to Peter Beck recently, and people like him are always say like, at some point there's going to be too many companies for too little launches.
Mhm.
Does Astra's coming in way super low cost? That should give them an edge, right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, it'll definitely give them an edge. One thing that definitely works in their favor toward this low cost is that they don't have an overhead at launch pads that have to be maintained, right? You don't have to constantly keep liquid oxygen, liquid kerosene systems up and running, no matter if you've got a rocket there. You don't have to, keep pad infrastructure ready to go near corrosive seaside environments, right? It's all sort of packaged together, and then you put it on shipping containers and you bring it where you need to go and erect it. That definitely helps lower a lot of the cost. I think what you're seeing in terms of where Astra is coming in at these price points, so you figure 3 missions for roughly $8 million, you can do the math and it works out to a little over 2 million a flight. Right. We know one of the things Rocket Lab is trying to get down to with reuse the isn't just cutting the price, which it will, but it's to introduce more rapid cadence turnaround, and that's another key element to Astra. It's another key element um, to Virgin Orbit. Yes, there are two of them, and I almost said the wrong one. To Virgin Orbit, and I think that's a key that you're seeing sort of throughout the smaller satellite launch market is it's not the competitiveness doesn't stem just from price point like it does on the larger rocket scale. It stems from the responsiveness. Because
Yes.
hey, if you, I mean, let's say you're looking at there and you're a small satellite launcher and you want to go in November of this year, and Astra says, okay, well, we need to build or Rocket Lab says, okay, we need to build a rocket, and Astra says, hey, we've actually got one right here. Price might not matter if you can hit the date that you want, and that's a hugely different aspect to the small satellite market that I don't think we talk about a lot. Is the on-demand launch vehicle element to that versus the larger satellite launchers, which obviously require more time because of how long it takes to build those really expensive, huge satellites.
Can
Gotcha.
I add one thing? So, so Relativity CEO Tim Ellis had a quote, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but he thinks that there's actually not enough small sat launchers, which is kind of like a hot take because there's
It
so many.
is.
But he thinks that like the market really doesn't even exist yet, but it will soon to support these small sat launchers. And I would tend to agree with him. And some people have made this analogy within the small sat launch industry is that we don't even know the market for small sats and their uses in a way that like when the iPhone came out and there wasn't yet an app store, we didn't yet know what people were going to do with the iPhone. And I think that's a good kind of comparison because there's just countless ways that small businesses and more probably more medium-sized businesses are going to utilize small sats and ultimately small launch in ways that we don't even know yet. So I kind of agree with Tim Ellis in that there's more of a broad perspective of how many launchers the market can support. I don't know if you guys maybe feel the same, but
Maybe
I
I,
think
I
that.
could.
Go ahead, Thomas. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just, yeah, I could see that point of view. I think, but the problem is, what if all these launchers are kind of coming up and being available before the payloads catch up? I guess it has to be a balance, right? What there has to be
yeah,
enough missions ready to get launching by the time all these rockets are ready to launch payloads. But
yeah,
yeah, and I know one perspective I can offer as a university student involved in university satellite programs is the more options there are. I mean, if you look at a cost for an Astra rocket that's less than 2 million or around 2 million, that's way lower than anything out there already. And that's a huge barrier to getting like a university payload up. It's just, you got to find a couple $1 million right now, which is not a trivial thing. So,
But
for
not
getting those kind of
65.
missions, right? Yeah, exactly. It's better, but still, it's not as good as what it could be, and that's a huge barrier. And so for a lot of those university missions, all of which almost rely on small satellite buses, um, that could be a huge thing. So yeah, I mean, I hope that he's right. I hope that all of these different launchers can bring something to the table and that there's good uses to come out of those. I think it would be really interesting. And plus more rocket launches to cover, so I guess we won't be complaining too much.
Yeah.
Um,
I just
yeah,
think we haven't yet really even put a toe in the proverbial pool of like what space can do for business. I kind of share that optimistic view, and I think it's going to be really exciting to see where the next kind of decade of small launch and small satellites and where all that takes us. I just think it's really exciting.
Well,
I'm just gonna keep this photo up, by the way, because this is one of the coolest photos John's taken.
Thanks.
I,
Can I share a quick anecdote on that photo?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I shot that in September, and it didn't immediately get released by Astra along with some of the other ones they shared from that launch. And by the time the excitement from that launch died down, it was clear that they were going to wait until the next launch was imminent for them to release it. So I had to sit on that photo for like 2.5 months, and I would just stare at it on my computer, not being able to share it because we're in working for Astra to do their images. They have the priority to release what they want when they want. So yeah, if I don't know if really anyone else can relate to that level of suffering because it's such a niche thing, but I had to stare at that for months before it was public. I'm
I
glad people can see it now.
I was gonna say, I think all three of us can relate to something even more harsh, which is knowing something that you can never,
Yes,
ever
yes,
Yeah.
say. Yeah.
There's a lot of
yes,
that.
yes. There's a lot of that in spaceflight news covering,
Yes.
isn't there?
There is. There is no John. I mean, this is a really good photo, and I think it's something because I wanted to come back a little bit to what we were talking about because I think there's another element that we're not that isn't talked about as much in this small satellite realm, right? When we talk about, well, how many launchers can the market actually sustain? And I think it's worth coming down to, like, it comes down in some parts to the power that the rockets have, right? So like these images that you've got, right, are capturing the power of those Delphin engines, right? It's got 5 of them. In
Hmm.
all, the Astra Rocket 3 vehicle can take about at most about 150 kilograms into low Earth orbit, whereas Electron can take about 500 kilograms
Hmm.
into low Earth orbit, and Electron can also take small satellites outside of Earth's orbit, which Rocket 3 can't do. Virgin Orbit, I said the wrong one again. Virgin Orbit, has a different maximum class. So you're also seeing in the 3 that have really emerged first, targeting. I mean, it's almost like you've got the biggest of the small sats, then the medium of the small sats, and then the smaller end of the small sat market, sort of nicely represented in this swath of 3 vehicles from these 3 companies. I think that's another important element of it because it's not that we're seeing so many small satellite vehicles coming online, it's that we're starting to see newer ones that are targeting different elements of the market.
Yes.
And I think that's a really important part of it. I think that's an important part of it as well because we've also seen small satellite startup companies fail, most notably Relativity, where there just wasn't a market for their vehicle and it didn't go anywhere. So the fact that others are continuing along and making it to market, I think, speaks well for the overall health of the industry.
That's another thing you point out, and we didn't really talk about this. We were talking about Firefly earlier. Firefly is almost not a small sat lifter. It's almost a class
They're
up into
almost
like the
medium.
light lift. They're almost like light to
Yeah,
medium lift because their payload capacity is way
Hmm.
bigger. So maybe that gives them a piece of the market that their other companies don't have. They also have a pretty large payload fairing. So maybe sort of a ride share of a bunch of small satellites is something they can manage, or those smaller satellites that aren't CubeSat size, but don't need a Falcon 9 or something like that. So maybe there is more room for all these launchers than kind of some people think. I know I would have no objection to having more and more rockets flying, so I think that would be my hope. But yeah, that's another interesting point to this. I did want to talk about just that ridiculously low launch cost and how I know we're all really excited for Astra flying again, hopefully really, really soon, and getting to orbit for the first time. I know they'll put customer payloads on board their next flight. I don't know if they said if they're going to go from Kodiak again or if they might go somewhere else. Like we said, they can kind of go from anywhere, but
I think the
should
last
be
I
really
heard them
interesting.
say that on that one was that the launch site was still to be announced.
Okay.
On that one, yeah, which is what made the NASA announcement of Quaj being the launch site the biggest sort of news of that announcement. I think was the now we're really seeing them move different locations
Yeah.
when needed.
Yep.
I can't think of many more remote places to launch from.
Than
Right.
Kodiak or Quaj? Yeah, they
And
seem to have
yeah,
that
Yeah.
nailed
both of
down.
those.
Yeah, they so for some context, for me at least, it's 3 flights to get to Kodiak, and it ends up being no shorter than 18 or 19 hours.
Mhm.
And generally speaking, on the way back home, it ends up being about 27 hours. And fun fact, I actually turned 21 in an Alaskan airport on my way home from the last launch. And it ended up being like a 27-hour journey, but it's worth it to get this level of proximity and insight into a very exciting and still honestly very young company.
Is
So
the
I'm thrilled to have that honor.
I'm fascinated. When it becomes 27 hours on the way back, which airport do you get stuck at overnight? Is it Seattle or Anchorage?
It ends up being Anchorage, but it's never stuck fully overnight. So the last time I had a layover from, I think, 6 p.m. to call it 2 a.m. So
Ah,
it's never enough, or it's very rarely enough to get a hotel. There's one time I did have an overnight in Seattle and got a hotel, but generally speaking, it ends up being like you're sitting in the airport for 7 hours,
mm.
which it's fun because it's after an exciting launch or campaign, and you get to kind of reflect on it. So, but like I said, it's worth it to get to see the company in this way. So, I love it.
I want to bring up a question we got here from chat. Sam wants to know, what does going public allow Astra to do that they could not do as a private company? I believe off the top of my head, Astra is now the second big kind of commercial spaceflight company going public. Virgin Galactic did it first. I don't know if I'm missing any. You'll correct me if I am. But what do you guys think about that aspect of it becoming a public spaceflight company? Either, if anyone wants to
I
jump on
have
that
I
one.
have one thing to add with the obvious disclaimer again, just in case anyone did not hear the first disclaimer. I cannot speak on behalf of the company, and I'm only relaying comments that have already been made by the company. But this will make Astra the first sort of like launch provider to the public,
Right.
because Virgin Galactic is more so a tourism company, like they're
Tourism.
launching people, but Astra is like an orbital launch delivery payload to orbit company, which I think is going to be a really interesting dynamic and something that I'm excited to see. But I'll let Chris add more to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the larger element of that, right? I mean, the funding possibilities when people can buy shares of your company and the sense of public engagement is a huge element to it, as well. It does make them more accountable. They have to be more public with a lot of things that happen once they do go public. They're accountable to the shareholders. So that will also be very interesting. We don't normally see rocket companies do that, just in general. So the fact that like an orbital company that's actually talking about like you know some big science missions in small little packages, it's impressive, and it should give us some insight into the overall accountability of the small satellite market as well, just from their unique niche.
Yeah, it should be very interesting. And I don't know, we might, I mean, there's been talk of SpaceX spinning off Starlink into sort of an IPO, a public side of that company. I don't know if there are other companies that are kind of thinking of going that route, but it might become a more kind of common thing in the industry. But we wanted to talk about Astra for a little bit, and just as an excuse to bring up John's photos since he's here. I mean, this landscape in Kodiak is absolutely gorgeous, and so we're all
Yeah,
jealous that you get to see that, and we're glad that you were able
that
to share them with photos and stuff like that.
that shot was from a helicopter actually. I
Wow.
think the last two, maybe 3 times of the four that I've been to Kodiak, I've gotten to fly on the range patrol flights that the Pacific Spaceport Complex, Alaska, puts on, just to make sure that the range is clear of hikers or really, boats. We've gone out over the water to check to see that boats that were either allowed to be there or not allowed to be there, and that also provides great aerial views of the rocket. And this photo was taken, I believe, right after a wet dress rehearsal, because you can see there's a portion of the lower 2/3 of the rocket that's still frosty.
Mhm.
When that's I can't recall the metal off the top of my head, but generally that's kind of like a bronze looking color metal. So there's a certain perimeter we have to stay out of while they're still detanking. But was cool to get this aerial view with mountains and stuff in the background.
That is awesome. We've got some other super chats and stuff that have come through. We'll try and get a couple of these. We got one here from Java Man. Says, I don't have enough wall space for all the great rocket photos. Have you considered publishing a book of photos telling the story of each company? I'm going to guess that that is directed towards Mr. Kraus. John Kraus book coming sometime soon?
You know, it's too early on in this process for me to announce it. And as much as I would love to announce it on NSF Live, I'm not ready to talk about that more than just saying that it's in the works and that it's a collab with someone exciting. But we're talking years down the line, so I'll leave it at
Sure.
that.
All right, well, we'll look forward to hearing more. And
Yeah,
Java Man, thanks for
yeah.
the super chat support there. All right, so I want to talk about some other stuff coming up, and we got one that I know John is super interested in. We'll start with the news side of this, and it's in part of the thumbnail, so you know I think what we're alluding to for a little bit. The Inspiration4 mission that we're all super excited to hear more about. And so, if you have missed it, a couple weeks ago, SpaceX and Jared Isaacman, a private pilot and entrepreneur, announced the Inspiration4 mission, which is a private mission aboard a Crew Dragon spacecraft launching from the Kennedy Space Center on a Falcon 9 as early as later this year, carrying 4 private astronauts, all civilians, to space for a couple days. And of course, Jared Isaacman, the kind of entrepreneur behind the mission, is one of the crew members, and they just announced the second, Haley Arsenault, who is a physician assistant and cancer survivor from St. Jude. The entire mission is kind of in support of St. Jude's Hospital. They're raising money together, and kind of the big thing is members of the general public can donate to St. Jude in order to enter for a chance to be one of the remaining crew members. So let's talk about that a little bit, and I'll bring it in with John because, well, I know, John, you're trying to get on this mission, right?
I am. Yeah, so the fourth and final seat is what they're calling the prosperity seat, and it's going to an entrepreneur who utilizes the Shift for Shop platform, which is sort of a subset of Jared Isaacman's Shift for payments. I guess service would be the best way to call it. Um, and you have to make a Twitter video sort of talking about how you're utilizing the Shift for Shop platform for your business, talk about your history as an entrepreneur. And I did that. I entered with my video on sometime earlier this week. I think it was
Something
Tuesday,
a
maybe.
little bit like this.
That would be it. You nailed it. So you may recognize the background. I filmed it in my room here with a couple prints. And yeah, I don't know if you want to play the whole thing. That might be a bit long-winded, but
I'll just
yeah,
have it
I
on the background
basically
because there's lots of cool
cool,
videos and
cool.
stuff. So
Yeah, so long story short, I made a video about sort of the 3 pillars why I want to fly on this flight. I talked a bit about my history as a photographer here in Florida, and one thing I really want to mention that I'm incredibly proud of, both myself for sort of organizing, but more so the people that took part, is that I was able to raise almost $10,000 for St. Jude, which is the same charity, of course, that the mission is supporting as a whole, through 2 exclusive limited edition signed print runs, one being a run of 50 prints, the next being a run of 25 prints. And I've never sold signed prints before, so this was sort of a way to sort of, get my followers to bite on something exclusive. And 100% of those profits went to St. Jude. And I sort of summed up the profits and made that donation this week, and alongside the release of my video. So yeah, that's sort of how I'm approaching it.
well, so this is exciting. So you're gonna hopefully get one of those seats. I know there's a couple other photographers also out there trying to kind of do similar things, and it's all part of a giant fundraising thing, which is why I think just personally it's super cool to like just literally support everyone who's trying to do this because you're all putting money towards St. Jude's, which is such a good cause. But hopefully at the end of it, we get one of our super talented photographers. And I know, I mean, if you got the opportunity to go to on Crew Dragon to space, I mean, any thoughts as to what you might try to capture if you even got that opportunity?
Yeah, I talked about this a little earlier today. One thing that I really love imagery I see from orbit is telephoto landscapes from space. Usually, I think on the space station they have like an 800 millimeter prime lens, and you can get some really unique compressed shots of very small portions of Earth, like relative to the size of the whole of Earth from orbit, that you can't even tell are from space. They almost look like they were shot through like a microscope. Like you put a leaf under a microscope and it looks like rolling mountains and clouds and stuff. So I think that first and foremost would be really exciting to capture, just abstract landscape. And then another thing is Isaacman has alluded to on Twitter that the apogee, meaning like the farthest point of Dragon's orbit, is going to be quote notable.
Right.
So I would assume that means we, as in the crew, if I'm chosen, will see a a large portion of Earth at once, maybe even all of it. So I'd love to get as much possible of Earth in the frame, like through the window. But beyond that, I haven't given it too much thought. It'd also be cool to get shots of like the four of us in the capsule, like sort of a selfie wide angle.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, just the opportunity to have that view and capture it would be pretty remarkable.
Well, so here's a problem, John, and I don't know if you've thought about this because clearly there's a flaw in your plan.
Oh
When
no.
if you're on the rocket, how are you supposed to photograph the launch? You're a launch photographer. How's that? How
Oh
are you gonna
boy.
do that?
Yeah, yeah. So it's good you have my website up because the image on the right there, which we were looking at earlier, that image was taken from a distance at which a human would be, to be blunt, killed from the sound and heat, or maybe maimed at worst. So part of the work I do is setting up these sound activated cameras near the launch facilities, which is the case here. So I don't know if I can make this claim definitively, but I'm pretty sure I would be the first person to photograph their own launch because, barring some weird rule, I do plan to set up remotes for my own launch if I'm chosen on the flight.
I
So
think they
that'd
can
be
probably
pretty
swing
cool.
that if you ask if you're
Yeah,
selected.
yeah. So to have like the raw photos beamed up to me while I'm in orbit and then edit and post them from orbit would be pretty cool, in my opinion.
I'm gonna bring up another photo, and we were talking about this earlier. I gotta find it. Here it is. Talking about because this is another one of those remote cameras that we love to talk about so much, and they come up with some of the coolest photos. But let's talk about this one because you actually had a story behind this one, didn't you?
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. I wasn't expecting that to come up if it didn't like organically come up. So thanks for bringing it up. So that photo is from the Falcon Heavy demo mission about 3 years ago. And you'll notice it's fairly similar to a lot of these close up flame detail shots that we see from a lot of people nowadays. Um, as more and more people shoot these launches, the sort of knowledge base grows of what people can capture. So a few years ago, these images weren't very widely spread. Now we see them a lot. But what you may notice about this photo is it doesn't actually have the engines of Falcon Heavy in the photo.
Yeah, I did not crop
And
this photo badly or anything. This is what the photo looks
yeah,
like, to be very clear.
that's like the photo as I uploaded. So that's actually the first photo that this camera captured, meaning that I did not get any images with the engines. And I was initially very, very bummed because, we had been waiting for Falcon Heavy for years. Even when I started photography 3 years prior, there was talks that Falcon Heavy was, as we kind of clown now, 6 months away. So this is something we had been looking forward to for a long time. So for me to sort of miss the shot as I planned it was very disappointing. But what I realized is the people that went for this shot probably, for the most part, got the engines. And I was forced to go with what I had, while most people went with the shot with the engines in it. So I sort of made the best of a crappy situation. And for the most part, no one else was really thinking to post the shots without the engine. So what's cool about this shot is it sort of symbolically represents the fact that the rocket has three cores because there's three very distinct lines. And this photo actually got picked up to be on the cover of Aviation Week a couple weeks later, which if I pan my webcam, I have the plaque on my wall of that magazine
Nice.
cover. So it's sort of just this story that I go back to in that um, you just got to look for different shots. And this was kind of early on in my career where I wouldn't think to regularly go for different shots, but it kind of enlightened me to just thinking outside the box one step farther than most people. So yeah.
So this is kind of cool because it wraps to a question that I've routinely come back to regarding the Inspiration4 mission. and the opening up to everyone and what the pillars mean and the name. And to me there's a large element when we talk about inspiration, we talk about hope, right? Where yes, people and individuals can represent those in specific moments in time, but like maybe there's a timelessness to it too. And so John, you want to go on this flight as one of right, obviously you want to go on this
Yes,
flight.
yes,
I
yes.
mean, um beyond just your physical presence on the flight, right, which would be wonderful for you. What is it that you hope the work that would come out of it for you would
Mhm.
mean to others?
Well, I talked about this a bit earlier today with someone else. I think spaceflight is unarguably like really, really cool. Like you have to be rather cynical to not be inspired by spaceflight. But I think one of the biggest problem is people just don't really know about it. And I think a lot more people would be deeply involved in following it if they knew about it. So I hope the photos I create can be a medium through which new people discover a love of spaceflight. And because spaceflight is so inherently freaking awesome, start to follow it and care about it in the way that we do now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, although I have a follow-up question.
Yeah, of course, of course. Oh,
John, what
that's
do
the
you what
Brady
what
Penguin photo.
it's the Brady Penguin photo, yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to. I'm bringing up more
Anyway,
Crew Dragon photos. It's relevant. Anyway, just don't mind me. You keep
yeah,
talking.
go on.
Um, no, John, you mentioned that to you, not a lot of people know about space, and I admit my immediate reaction to that was like, well, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. How can you say that when thousands of people are watching us right now on
Yes.
this, and hundreds of thousands of people tune in when spaceship might fire up its engines? What do you mean when you say that space is still a mystery to a lot of people?
I just think it's still at a place where it doesn't feel attainable to a very overwhelming majority of the general population. And I think with this mission being the first all civilian, all private mission, it's going to make space feel a lot more accessible, which I think may pique people's interest in a way that we haven't seen before. And I talk a bit in my video about being the youngest person to go to space, which I would be if chosen for this flight. And I think that could sort of inspire and usher in a newfound interest among young people to start following space, which I think is what we need because, um, like, the future of spaceflight resides with young people. And we just got to get those young people interested in what space has to offer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I keep bringing up these photos by John because he's got a whole gallery, and I wanted to use his photos. I don't know. This one's pretty cool. You got some plants in the foreground,
Yeah,
and you got the rocket in the background. I don't know, John. You familiar with this kind of composition at all?
yeah. So that transporter won a little over a month ago, and oh my goodness, what'd you do to my?
I was waiting for it.
Wow, that's amazing! Wow. Well done. All right, let me go find it. Um, anyway, yeah, that was from Transporter One, from miles away, and very rarely do I get to experiment with kind of foreground like that from so far away, just because it's so tricky. But clearly, as you're illustrating here, it was worth it.
It is a really awesome photo. I got a message saying
Thanks.
that I should bring up a photo with some foliage in the foreground because the producers
That's
had a trick
funny.
up their sleeve. So
That's pretty good. I love it. And you caught me by surprise. That was unscripted, guys. I did not know that was happening.
let's talk about. So you did point out a couple photos that are kind of like your sort of favorites. But I don't know if John, if you want to like talk about some of these. Also, I'm going to keep looking for some questions and stuff to bring up. But in the meantime, any sort of photos you kind of want to like talk about?
Yeah, the Mars 2021
Yeah,
be
sure.
would
Let's
be
do
fun to
that.
talk
I mean,
about.
Mars 2020 got some news this week anyway.
Yeah.
So this was an aerial photo, I believe. Well, obviously,
Yes.
I would be impressive if it wasn't somehow.
So
But
yeah,
John can just jump really high.
yeah.
yeah.
Uh,
So a lot of people think that's a drone photo, but it's not. It was actually shot from about 5,000 feet above the sort of Cocoa Beach, Cape Canaveral border from a Cessna 172 aircraft with the window open and me, I wouldn't say hanging out the window, but shooting out the window. It was a rather choreographed flight. We ascended in about 5 loops, and we had to time the last loop so that we were heading on the right compass heading at launch time, which my pilot, whose name is Scott, he just absolutely nailed that. We had a meeting a few days before this to talk over what exactly I was looking for in his services as a pilot. And what's funny about this guy Scott is he was so nonchalant because he's such a consummate professional that he just understood so clearly what I was after that it was concerning when we were flying that he would just be like, yeah, yeah, like, yeah, we're working on it. Like, we're getting up there. And like, meanwhile, I'm like freaking out. The launch is in 4 minutes. I'm like, dude, are we gonna be there? He's like, yeah, yeah, like, be there. And it was just so I mean, he just absolutely nailed it. And another cool thing about this photo is, as you both are familiar with, and I'm sure many people are watching are familiar with, the Atlas V rocket likes to sometimes take its time pushing into the launch window in 4-minute increments.
You guessed my question, Sean.
So so go ahead and ask the question because probably allow me to touch on some other parts of the shot and the timing of it.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously, this was timed right for the opening of the window because the Atlas ended up
Yes.
going right at the opening of its window at 7:50 a.m. But it
Yes.
had a 2.5-hour launch window. How did you account for that in the planning for this shot? And how would you have handled? I mean, obviously, the Atlas can't just like hold after T minus 4 minutes. It has to hold and recycle back, and so you've got some time. But how did you balance a 2.5-hour launch window with this shot?
We balanced it in the fact that it went on time. So so we didn't have reliable cell service at altitude, so we would have had to climb back down to a more manageable altitude to get an update. So had it not launched at 750, we probably would have went back down to, we'll call it 1,000 feet, gotten an update, and then gone from there. Um, One thing that I don't know if I've spoken of this publicly yet, but you guys may remember there was literally an earthquake at JPL at
Hmm.
like 7:30, 20 minutes before the
Hmm.
launch window opened or something. And I managed to catch that about 30 seconds before I lost cell signal. So I
So
That
the
still
was your
hear
was
that
that your last
there's,
update then? Is that what you're saying?
yes, that was my last update. So we're ascending and I get this update that says there's literally an earthquake at where like the customer is controlling their end of this launch. And I'm thinking like there is no way that these smart people at JPL aren't going to go, okay, we need to hold for an hour to make sure that this one obscure ground system wasn't ruined by the earthquake and we can still talk to this, billions of dollars of rover technology. And I'm like, we're screwed. Like this isn't going to happen, but because we didn't have cell, we had to just go for it. And very luckily it went on time. So, yeah.
yes, this is why you always have backups in
Yes,
space flight.
and you raise an interesting point in saying the word backup. Um, had this rocket not launched on July 30th, I would have not been there for it. So I
Right.
took this flight knowing that I only had one shot. I could not just do it again the next day, and the reason being, I actually had to fly to Alaska about 4 hours after this launch for Astra. So had it not went that day, this shot would not exist.
So
Well,
um
it worked
so
out
so
because this photo is
if you're
so
related,
amazing. And I know they have don't
Thank
they
you.
have this at JPL now somewhere?
Yeah, yeah, it's at a facility at JPL. I think it's like kind of their media department has it up at the end of a hallway, maybe 8 or 10 feet tall. So pretty cool to see.
so one other thing that fascinates me about this, John, right, is everyone's going like, but you were in a plane, range
Yeah.
violation. How on a flight like this on launch day, right, where you're totally where you're supposed to be and everything, how
Hmm.
much communication is there with air traffic control that day to or the range officials to make sure you are where you're supposed to be? They
Hmm.
know even if you're flying at a restricted zone, to turn around. Like how much of that
Hmm.
coordination is there that you have to experience for a shot like this as well?
Yeah. So I'm not a pilot. Just my pilot was a pilot. But he sort of
That's
explained
good.
to me that generally speaking, you can't go north of the port during a launch, and then there's also some zones that extend out. But beyond that, so one thing that's important to point out is that this photo is a little farther south than it looks. I think
You can
we were
see the
right
port
around
at the
like the
bottom.
520
Yeah.
causeway. Yeah. So basically, that foreground is where we couldn't be passed. Um, and the pilot was just a trained professional, and he's flown a lot. He knew to avoid the TFR, and it really was as simple as that. He had communication with air traffic control, but to my knowledge, he didn't have to be in contact with the range because we were very clearly outside of that zone.
Gotcha.
Any of these other photos that you want me to bring up, John? And I know there's a bunch of questions coming up, so we can get to those in a second. But are there any other photos you wanted to bring up? I've got some from
Um,
South America here.
that is maybe we could touch on that for like a minute, and then there's one more photo that I'd want to go into with a little more detail. But sure, bring up
Okay.
the French Guiana shots. Yeah, so this was from French Guiana. That is an Ariane 5 rocket taking off from French Guiana in South America. So fellow photographer Trevor Mallman and I were kindly hosted by both ESA, the European Space Agency, and Ariane Group for a launch back in November of 2019. And they were kind enough to let us set up cameras quite literally on the flame trench. So there is flame that is going underneath this camera. Like this camera is literally on the flame trench, kind of looking down at the launch mount. Um, it was cool. That's pretty much the one word to describe it. It was cool.
It is very cool. All right, what was this other photo you wanted us to talk about a little bit?
The Falcon 9 reflection.
Sure. Oh, well, I know part of the story behind this, but I'll let you tell it, of course.
Yeah.
Oh
So
yes, I remember
this,
this one.
yeah.
This is
So people may recognize this. This was the first print that I sold as a part of this charity fundraiser. I did 50 signed 8x10 prints of this photo. So you're looking at the launch of Falcon 9 and Telstar 18 Vantage. And you're also looking at the reflection of that launch in the waters north of Cape Canaveral. And I was actually in the water with this camera for this shot. And the reason the camera had to be so close to the water was because I was trying to get the entire reflection in addition to the launch to sort of make this perfect near semicircle. And I had tried this shot a few months prior from the same location at a dock right nearby. And I don't exactly know like the sort of angular physics behind this, but because I was so high above the water, I wasn't able to get that full reflection. So I realized I needed to be right on the water. So my tripod was at its maximum height, like 4 feet tall, in the water, in the muck, and I climbed into the water to get this shot.
And
it's an
for
it's an
those who
it's
have
an
not made the
incredible
connection yet,
yeah.
this is in Florida, water in
Yes.
Florida.
Yes.
So, fighting off gators to protect the camera. But it worked out because this photo is so awesome. But we
Thanks.
did all
It's one of
question
my
John a
favorites.
little bit when he said, I'm going to get in alligator infested waters for a launch photo tonight.
Oh, what's great is
Yeah,
he didn't even
and
tell
another
us
thing.
ahead of time. He just told us
No,
afterward,
yeah,
and
I
about
Right, well,
half the
yeah.
people went cool, and half the people went, "Are you insane?"
yeah. So also after a lightning storm, which is
Oh,
like another
perfect.
footnote on
Fantastic.
that photo. Yeah, so it was cool. I had a camera crew from Vice News with me for that launch, and they did this sort of mini doc on my work, as a whole and at this launch. And a lot of people are like, "Oh, you only did this like you're a daredevil because you had this camera crew with you." That is not true. This shot was planned before they reached out to this documentary, and I would have done it, camera crew or not. So it's cool that that documentary sort of captured this for me as I look back on it in the years to come.
It is awesome. All right, I know I've got a whole queue of super chats and stuff like that, so let's talk about some of these. And I know we've got some questions that I want to bring in John and Chris for. A couple of these are like Starship related, and we're going to get to Starship in just a minute. Don't you worry. So I'll save those for a little bit. But first and foremost, well, we kind of talked about this a little bit, but I'll bring it up again. Super chat from Rough Riders. Thank you so much. Did any of you apply to fly on Inspiration4? And if so, DOS needs to send up some robots. Well, I think we all know John has already made his big entry. And of course, we're all hoping for the best for that. I know I personally put in a little bit of donation, not as much as John is, but I did donate a little bit to the St. Jude's cause, and who knows what happens to that. I don't know. Chris, did you apply?
I donated. I don't know if I'd call it apply, but I donated
Right.
for it.
Donated,
Yes.
right, for the entries or whatever. So I don't know. I think all of us would be pleasantly surprised with that opportunity. It would be pretty cool. And I don't know. Maybe if any of us get selected, DOS can convince us to bring a robot with us or something. I don't know. But thank you for the support there. Let's see. Any other questions here I want to get to? Oh, here we got a question here for John. Where can we buy high quality prints of yours on aluminum sheets? Do you do metal prints, John? And if so,
I
where might we
do.
find them?
That's so convenient that someone asked. You can go to johnkrausphotos.com, and virtually every photo on the website has a buy button, and you can shop various mediums. I do paper, I do canvas, I do metal, in sizes from 8 by 10 all the way up to like 2 by 3 feet, with international shipping. So go crazy.
There we go. So check out
And can I
John
add one
Kraus
more
photos.
thing to that?
Yeah.
As we speak, I'm going to add a coupon code that is NSF in all lower, and you will save 20% off for the next day if you use that code at checkout. I hope that is okay.
That-
That works. Yes.
Cool. Yeah, so
Thomas,
feel
if you're
free to
still
use it.
frozen, I don't
Hear
know.
that,
But
chat? 20% off.
there you
Check
go.
out John Kraus photos. There you go. So let's talk about. Well, we talked about one shiny rocket. We talked about Astra a little bit. They have a shiny rocket, but let's talk about the other shiny rocket. And Michael, I don't know if you want to cut directly to the live video that may have flashed on screen ever so briefly for a second there. But apparently something's going on at Boca Chica, like right now. Did you guys get me back?
You there?
I'm here. Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, we hear
Oh,
you,
is Chris
Michael.
gone?
Sorry,
I think-
sorry. We hear you, Thomas.
Okay, my internet cut out for a second, but I was going to Michael because they're doing something in the high bay in Boca Chica, so we got to talk about Starship stuff now. I believe that might be a section of a super heavy booster being lifted in the high bay,
I was going
which
to
is of
ask.
course via the NSF robot army.
I was going to ask which section is this for which vehicle?
I believe this is a super heavy section. It's hard to tell exactly what they're doing, but this is live from Boca Chica, so
yeah, super heavy lift is what Michael's saying in the background. Yeah.
you know, it's kind of a fair chance whenever you point a camera at Boca Chica, something's happening. So figured we'd show this
I
really
don't know
quick.
how you guys track it. It's crazy how much goes on there.
Yeah, this
It's
is
hard
It's
to.
like it's insane to comprehend, honestly.
So let's talk a little bit about Starship and what's going on. I'll bring up some other videos from this week. Of course, the biggest item being Starship SN10 static fire, which now has done for the second time, and it looks like the second time went well. So let's talk about that. I don't know, John, you heading to Boca Chica sometime soon?
At this point, no. We're gonna have to see how the schedule shapes out with SN10 and the Starlink here. And I looked at flights, and they're like absurdly expensive for me to get there quickly. But if we see a few day delay, then maybe I'll fly or drive. But as of right now, probably not.
Right now, flight is no earlier than Monday, and that is based on the successful static fire, which happened just a few days ago, or a few days ago, yesterday. And of course, they had to do an engine swap. Yeah, I can see that the video is kind of jumping around a little bit. I'm sorry about that. We'll see if we can get that fixed. But Starship did do a static fire yesterday after an engine swap, and now I think that we've heard that everything's kind of go for their flight next week. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. They're gonna fly on Monday. What are the chances that Starship actually lands this time? Any guesses on that front?
Do I get to cheat and say nope? No, I know how I'll answer this. I will answer this in the immortal words of our friend and colleague Eric Kuna. There's a 100% chance that it'll land when it lands.
When it lands. I think Oh, I'm glad you brought this up because we didn't get to talk
Yeah,
about
I'm
it
gonna bring
earlier.
up more John
This
photos
SN9
because the video
photo.
isn't really working
Yeah.
anyway. So
So, so I think that I mean, it's easy to say this in hindsight, but I think generally speaking, the space community massively overestimated the chances that SN9 was going to land. And I was guilty of that. I was pretty convinced it was going to land until the very distinct moment that it was still like sideways at less than one starship altitude above the pad. Um, and you know, I think we're still at the point where I would personally be surprised if SN10 did land. I'd love to be proven wrong. But I think it's just such a new maneuver that they still have a ways to go before nailing it. But again, I want to see them succeed, so hopefully they can do it.
So
I,
there was a funny story, and this photo of yours reminded me of it, because there was similar video, right, of like it going up and then coming down in the same frame, and everything, and and this, of course, this was after we knew what had happened, and my Pandora station that I was listening to as it was just cycling through random songs got to a random song with the outright perfect lyric at like this basic visual of it going up on the left and then slamming back down on the right, which it was as it was going up, it was the lyrics were just start believing in yourself. And then as it comes back down, it's basically there will be times of trouble. It's going to hurt like heck right when it hit the ground.
Yeah,
And I will forever have that seared into my brain for how perfectly coincidental it was.
that's funny.
But I think to
So
your larger point, John, you're right. I think SN8 gave us as a community a false sense of how far along the program was.
yes,
And
I
that
think SN8 was
maybe
a huge surprise.
oh,
Um,
100%.
yeah, I
100%.
personally
Yeah.
thought so. So one thing on this, I did not. I mean, none of us really had an understanding of the profile that this flight was going to take. But the fact that the SN8 sort of like very slowly coasted to an apogee and then hovered at its apogee and then like really slowly rotated to its belly flop maneuver. That was a surprise for me. I thought it was sort of going to be like cut off the engines and then like it uses inertia to reach apogee as it's turning. And I thought that maneuver was just going to be way more honestly violent. And I thought that was where they were going to run into trouble on SN8, but they proved us wrong. I mean, they did it with seemingly incredible precision and slow speed. So I think just the fact that it got as far as it did, like we've said, set up sort of false expectations for how far along they really were.
Yeah, because it's easy. Like I know we said a lot in the run up to it. Like remember, like just because SNE did well doesn't mean there's something in there that didn't show up in the data. Right.
Hmm.
Doesn't mean there wasn't something where you got lucky that would show up on a different flight, which is then exactly what happened with SN9 in the Raptor reignition there for the flip and burn.
Hmm.
So it'll be interesting to see how 10 handles the ignition of three of them and then the shutdown of one of them. I think that's more so the part I'm looking at. Most closely or with SN10 or will be looking more closely at SN10, but I think it's worth stressing again, which I know we will as we get closer to this flight, especially on the day of, is it's still somewhat surprising that the Raptors have worked continuously for as long as they have, right? For the
Yeah,
developmental engines
yeah,
that they are. I mean, there's a reason on SN8 why we were saying so many times, like, if it just gets to apogee, it's a huge win.
yes,
Everything after that is
yes.
gravy. And now the first two have shown really what appear to be solid performance from those Raptor engines, which is really good. And of course,
And I
that'll
think
only get
that's
better, but that's still a huge sort of
yes,
question mark of the
yes.
test program.
That that solid Raptor performance on the way up, I think, is not getting enough credit because SN8 was the first high altitude flight test. It was the first test with a nose cone. So just the fact that they had control of it and they didn't, to our knowledge, did not have Raptor problems on the way up is a huge win. And we kind of saw in some of the more mainstream publications like, SpaceX rocket explodes, but they didn't really account for the fact that just the fact that it got to the point where it could explode at the landing pad is remarkable in itself.
Right, right. And yeah, because it's easy to, because most of the time, right, when we see these test campaigns for rockets, they're not test campaigns where failure is a good thing. Right. This isn't like if
Yes.
SLS had a failure akin to a Starship landing failure here during the hot fire, and NASA's just like, oh well, we've already got the next one,
Yeah.
just down the road. But that's sort of how we've been bred to think about it over 50 years, over 60 years. And this is a very huge paradigm shift for how we're testing. And of course, I don't think it I think it's very funny and very ironic that it's happening in parallel with a more standard large scale test campaign with SLS, which of course has to get it right, because of the difference between government and private test campaigns and what the public will allow and what they won't when it comes to their own tax dollars. Is
I'm
this
gonna.
live?
Yeah, I was gonna say, Michael, is this another live robot view or is this recorded footage that we're seeing now? This is
What are they
live.
doing at the tank farm?
I think that's just the
What?
sort of normal venting from the storage tanks. I think that's standard. You can see their
Oh,
cars on
okay.
their own stuff.
With
There's nothing cleared or anything.
Yeah.
There was not supposed to
It
be any
does
like Boca Chica
make
testing
noise.
today for the disclaimer
well,
before
that's
people start asking when the launch is.
well,
But
that too. That's that. Well, and I saw the vapors, which is why I was like, wait a minute.
but okay, so we were talking about SN8, how that was such a huge surprise. SN9 might have shown how much of a surprise it really was. But of course, SN10 flying no earlier than Monday. Let's just say hypothetically, SN10 or whatever Starship finally gets there sticks the landing. What comes next? What do you guys think we're going to be looking for next? And I'm asking this because I'm starting to bring in some questions from chat here. Thomas, thank you for the super chat. What would the next flight looks like? Are we going to higher altitudes? Are we going to higher speeds? Both? We getting suborbital space next time? What do you guys think Starship does next? What's the next step?
If SN10 lands successfully, SN11 has to repeat it. That's the next step.
You think from
Only
the same altitude?
repeat
Prove it can do it again?
exactly.
I think that's right.
Exactly. You gotta be able to repeat it after you do it once. Once is great, but if you can't do it again,
Yeah.
it's meaningless for the system. So
Yeah.
that's the next thing. If SN10 can land, SN11 has to repeat the flight profile to prove that it can be done.
Can't you do
And then
that
we
though if you
go.
go to like let's they go to like 50 kilometers or something? You still have to do the landing maneuver at the end. So would it make sense to push the apogee higher even though you're also going to have an opportunity to repeat the landing maneuver if that's what you're really if that's the focus of what you want to repeat?
So there would be an interesting messaging problem for SpaceX if they opted to do that, because the messaging so far has been there's no appreciable difference between 20 kilometers, 15 kilometers, 12.5, and 10 for what they're wanting to test.
Right.
So if they suddenly
Right.
went, now we have to do it at 15 or it's bust, a lot of people, ourselves included, would rightfully have to ask the question and press the question every single time. Then why was the altitude lowered just to improve winds when you said no appreciable difference?
I was thinking 50 kilometers, 50. So a big altitude increase, not 15, 50.
Well, you're
I'm
into a
talking
whole different realm of test.
halfway to space at that point.
Well, you're in a whole different realm of testing at that point, and that's not what they're testing right now with Starship. They're literally just trying to nail the the belly flop, come back down and land. You don't
Sure.
need 50 kilometers for that. I mean, 50 kilometers, you're into I mean, you're into supersonic phases during
Hmm.
ascent. You're
Right.
into supersonic elements during descent and transitioning back and forth at different phases. That's not what they're. I get this overall spirit of your question. I'm just also trying to be very upfront that's not where we are right now in the test regime. Now, what the test regime changes to once we get SN15, which has more of the upgraded designs and the next phase of iterations for the design changes of Starship, is a more open question, because you might be into scenarios where you want to test or start testing different things in the vehicle. But I think if the question is specifically aimed at just SN10, SN11 needs to repeat the flight profile.
Do you think they could repeat the flight profile with SN10 again if it lands successfully? Could they refly SN10?
Ooh, that's a fun one.
Yeah, so this is a fascinating question, because it will ultimately come down to where the design team and where Elon specifically thinks the most data can be gleaned from it. There is a lot to be said for sticking it back on the test stand, fueling it up again, and launching it again. Although I'll caution that maybe these initial prototypes aren't necessarily the ones they'd want to refly since the design is changing. Um, but yeah, so it'll be interesting because they could go two routes. They could either do what's called destructive evaluations on it, where you take it apart to see how every piece of it held up during the flight, which would be incredibly valuable engineering data to have to validate your computer models, right? Sort of like what we see them do with that SN7.2 tank, which is on the lower right hand side of your screen.
Which they still haven't finished testing, by the way. So we're still waiting for like that to happen. But
Correct. And that testing that you're talking about, Thomas, right? They've already done pressure and cryotemp
Mhm.
tests on it. And this tank is the newer, thinner 3 millimeter steel. Um, so, but what we've seen them do is not just do the normal pressurization and cryogenic tests with it, but then outright pressurize it to failure. Because what that does when you can pressurize it to failure is you can look at, okay, where did the computer model say it should fail versus where did it actually fail? And usually what you want to do is build it so it fails after your computer models say it would fail, so you know you've really, really, really built it well, and within a certain factor of safety. So there are things that you can, and there are only, and there's in some respects there are the only ways you can perform those analyses on flight articles is to take them apart or destructive evaluation. You could also do a series of non-destructive evaluations where you basically X-ray the thing to death, trying to find um, flaws or abnormalities, or just generally assess the health of the steel that was used. And then you could put it back on the test stand and you could fuel it back up. You could static fire some Raptors. You could see how the whole structure itself holds up. Or it's just going to come down to where do they feel they can get the most out of the analysis if it lands successfully.
And they may learn they have margin in places where they never would have guessed they had margin, which, I
Mhm.
mean, they
Mhm.
could shave off mass by doing that. Maybe we over engineered this section
Mhm.
and we validated our models even further than we expected to validate them. And then they shave mass. So,
Yep.
yeah, I mean, there's so many ways they can, assuming they do successfully land one in the next one or two, approach their testing.
And we have actually seen, to your point there, John, right? Like we've actually seen something kind of similar to that, where performance has been increased because you realized you over engineered something,
Yes.
on a rocket that is in no way comparable to what Starship is being developed to do, but a very capable rocket nonetheless. Northrop Grumman's Antares vehicle, which launches the Cygnus resupply Crafts space station, when they were upgrading it from its 230 variant to 230 plus, they realized that some of the over engineered elements of it would actually allow them to remove other components and then not throttle the engine down during max Q. So you could just keep punching at full acceleration through the lower atmosphere. And that was just
Yes.
done through, once they flew it and they saw how it was actually operating with the engines, they were like, oh, well, we actually don't need this. And we built it so well, we don't have to throttle the engines down. Great. So it is fascinating what these what the rockets can tell you once you get them back, or once you analyze the data in a certain way after a successful
And
flight.
someone's going to ask, this is pre-recorded. What you're looking at is not live.
Right. Michael is working on getting the video back, and you see that was a clip of the second SN10 static fire, which happened just yesterday and was, of course, apparently successful. So we're hoping that, of course, that clears the way for flight next week.
Which also
I'm
can.
gonna
Oh, also,
go ahead.
I think it's very much worth talking about, because we had two static fires today or this week, that were back to back on Friday, on Wednesday and Thursday, of this week. But though, and we've seen static fires, right? Multiple static fires across multiple days
Hmm.
before, but this one was particularly impressive because they swapped out a Raptor in between them and still managed
Yeah.
back to back firing. So if that doesn't tell you some of the cadence that they're at right now in being able to swap out components very quickly on these vehicles, because the more you can make something universal, where you're basically doing plug and play instead of, oh, well, this tile is specifically designed for this particular area of the vehicle and it can't go anywhere else. You can see how much more efficient systems can become just in this initial test campaign too.
And they went from what, like SN8, they replaced a Raptor. It was in the realm of like 20 days, something like that. And then SN9, a similar thing, to literally a day turnaround, which is just remarkable.
Yeah, I think the two that you're thinking of there, John, there were some other extenuating circumstances. I think one of those, right, was when the concrete pad broke up and like broke some things in it.
Oh, I see, I see.
But to your
So
point
there are
about
probably damages
SN9,
beyond simply swapping a Raptor.
exactly. But to your point about
We would assume.
SN9,
Okay.
all we got from SN9 was a very similar statement to Elon, right? That there was like a couple of Raptors that were suspect on SN9, but it was still 3 or some odd weeks. Of course, they were battling FAA stuff with that one too, so it's a
Yeah.
little hard to judge how much of that was just the Raptor versus the FAA and the whole debacle that unfolded there. But yeah, one static fire, swap out an engine and static fire in 24 hours. I mean, that's
Mhm.
impressive no matter how you look at it.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep bringing in some questions here from chat. Keep them coming. Let's see. How will Phobos and Deimos, so those are the two drone ship rigs, and we can bring up a little bit of news on that front, but how will the square footage compare to the landing platforms of the drone ships? Of course, I still love you and just read the instructions. I believe they are significantly larger than the drone ships, right, Chris?
They are. I would liken this to it's the difference between attempting to land on like a room in your house, like an area the size of like the floor space of the room of your house versus a football field, um, or a soccer field, however you want to say that sport. Hi, Chris.
He's gonna pop in,
So,
isn't he?
yeah, he's just going to pop in and say, hold on, it's round ball and helmet ball. That's how we differentiate the two.
Yeah, but this was
Uh,
some interesting news this week, though.
Right, yeah. So Elon said that the goal is to have one of them operating in a limited capacity by the end of the year, and that Starships, in order to get to the platforms and begin their operations there, will simply hop there from a land-based launch site, which I guess makes sense. Yeah,
Which
we're gonna do kind of hop tests anyways, so it makes sense. But
I just want to
yeah,
I just want to honestly say you may have heard that first here on NSF because we got, as soon as when we were breaking the story, the question was being asked, how will they get starships to the platforms? And the answer that I sort of gave off the cuff was they'll fly them there. Nah. There we go.
It's one of
so
those things that's like so straightforward that you would be more surprised if they don't simply fly them there,
Right.
right? Like like are they gonna build a whole other system to like lower it horizontally and like put it on a boat? Like no, they just launch it there.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is the other element to the puzzle, right? That Elon is saying, like, yes, they will be floating platforms. Yes, we can reposition them if we need to, but stationed around the world. Like, this is not only for orbital operations. This is putting infrastructure in place in subtle ways that can also achieve Earth point to point.
all
Make
right, I'm gonna
sense?
keep
Like two
bringing
for
in.
one.
I'll go for it.
Someone was asking about that Starship Sun photo. Could I touch on that one for
Oh
maybe
yeah,
30
sure. I
seconds or a
bring it
minute?
right back up.
Yeah. So this photo is from the lift of SN10, which occurred after SN10 arrived at the launch pad, which was really cool because SN9 had not yet flown. So
Hmm.
we saw two starships on adjacent launch mounts at the same launch facility. And, I don't want to like make this prediction now, but we may never or very few times see that in the near term future. I don't want to say ever because you never know with SpaceX, but to see two starships right next to each other was really cool. And this shot, someone was asking about the like, why does the sun look the size that it is? So it's basically something called telephoto lens compression. Um, the sun is very far away, and the starship is much closer. And when you zoom into the starship, the sun just sort of looks bigger in comparison. Let me like off the cuff think of a good way to put it. So if you can imagine like a person standing, call it 50 meters from you, and you hold up your thumb a meter from your face. Your thumb is going to look very large compared to the person, but we know in our head that our thumb is not larger than a person. So it's sort of just this like distance compression that happens when you zoom in on something that's far away, and that's the case here. So this was from like 3/4 of a mile away, somewhere between a half mile to 3/4 a mile. And one thing that I can tease is that this photo is going to imminently end up somewhere pretty cool. That's all
Ah,
I'll say.
nice.
Yeah, yeah,
That is an awesome photo. I love the shot of the people working on the launch stand as they do the lift. It is a very cool photo.
yeah. Thank you. And final thing on it, I did make sure that via one of the SpaceX people we interface with as media. I made sure that this was sent to the people that could make sure that the people in the photo got to see it, which means a lot to me
Nice.
having shot it. So cool little personal touch there. Anyway, that's all I
Nice.
got on that photo.
That is very cool. I'm gonna keep bringing up some more questions and stuff. We got a whole bunch from chats. Let's see what else can we talk about. A question here from Dan: do they test fire Raptor engines before installing them on Starship? I believe the answer is yes. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the Raptor engines are built out in Hawthorne, California, at SpaceX's main production facility and headquarters out there, and then they route through um, mm, McGregor. There we go. And then they route through McGregor, Texas, for firing operations and testing operations, and then they are shipped down to Boca Chica for installation and use throughout the Starship program.
Right, so it's not the first time they get tested when they get installed on a Starship vehicle. They get installed. So what I guess like the angle of that question is likely SN9 had a Raptor engine problem. So
Hmm.
are those problems just not coming up in their McGregor testing, or are there differences with performing on a
Ah,
test stand versus on a vehicle?
I I give a sarcastic John Kraus answer.
Yes.
I think like what they're doing in relighting a rocket engine as the entire system is like going through this unbelievable aerodynamic stress as it's like rotating. I think that's just something you can really, and I say this like jokingly, but it's for real. You can't test that outside of flight. How
right.
often do we see rocket engines relit when the vehicle is not more or less straight up, or the
Mhm.
engine is not more or less sideways on a test stand? So I think it's just one of those things. Like, how do you test it outside of flight? You don't, so you do it in flight.
Yeah, there's a large element of that in terms of the overall stresses that the engines are under as the vehicle is ascending or descending. Right, most of that you can simulate on a test stand, but not all of it. Right, including the interplay of all of them, and how the control logic is gimbaling each one of them individually to maintain the rocket's stability. I think to the point about the successive firings and the issues that we've had. Um, so this isn't following any different in a very grounded way. This isn't following a different process than what the Falcon 9s do, right? The difference is mainly that the Falcon 9s and their Merlin engines are small enough where you can transport the entire stage through McGregor, test fire it all together, ship it to the launch site, it gets integrated, it goes out for a static fire, and then up you go. Right. The only difference here is that the scale of Starship usually means like it's one Raptor that goes through a test stand at a time, gets checked out, gets shipped down, and then they all get integrated together because Starship is just literally too big to be hauling around the country like this.
Yeah, that'd be a sight to see, though.
Yeah.
Just
But
seeing SN10
but
get rolled from the production facility to the launch stand was like a 3 hour ordeal or something, and that was
ah,
cool to see. So imagine that like on I-10, just like a Starship
exactly.
moving 5 miles an hour.
Well, I mean, not just that. I mean, Lord, there are some interstates it couldn't fit on. It's too wide.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
too big. Just in that regard. So in terms of the engines firing, it's not following a different pattern than everything else in SpaceX is following right now. The issues that we see with them, and here's where you will always hear me say this, and I'll beat this horse to death until we're farther into the program, because it is very important to understand. These are still technically development engines. These are not
yes,
the engines that are going to fly the operational missions. they're still working out the kinks with the Raptors. Part of the design program is to not just work out the kinks with the vehicle itself, but with the propulsion technology. And a large part of that is seeing how it works when you rapid fire them like this. So we even saw one day, right, where they put the entire system on SN9 through the paces where they fueled it, static fired it, detanked it, safed it, fueled it again within an hour, static fired it, detanked it, safed it, fueled it again within an hour, static fired it, detanked it, saved it, right? And they just rapid fire went through that. And it was on that rapid fire thing that they found one of the problems with the engines on SN9. So it's not surprising that we've seen engines fail on test programs. I will remind everyone who will listen, and John, you're here, and it's your favorite rocket.
I know it's coming.
There were space shuttle main engines that
Oh,
were carrying humans for the very first time that were still failing a year and a half before the first flight because they were the developmental engines, not the flight engines. So not out of the realm of what we would expect where things are right now. Now, 5 years into the program, if we're still having these problems with Raptors, we've got a problem because they're not as reliable as they need to be, with because these things also have to be able to cruise through an interplanetary void for months, enter a
relight.
planetary atmosphere, and relight like they've been firing for days. They've got to be able to do that. So
I think one impressive note is that these are developmental engines, yes, but they're spitting them out at an insane cadence to support these testing. So imagine when they have this design more or less finalized. I'm sure they'll iterate even when they're in production. But imagine the cadence we'll see for Raptor production when the design is finalized. I mean,
yeah,
it's going to be asinine.
it really will, and like I can't wait to because we've already seen one photo in the production facility at Hawthorne in California of the vacuum Raptor.
Hmm.
I mean, and the
It's
engine
like
bell
way
on
bigger
that
than the
thing.
person near it.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, the engine bell on that thing is incredible. I can't wait to see one of those in the wild with a photo like this, where like the vacuum Raptor rolls by the immortal Starhopper photo bombing in the
Yeah.
background here. Yeah, I can't wait for that because those engines, the nozzles on them are mind-blowingly large, which they need to
You
be.
mean this
Can I
one?
throw?
That one, yes.
Oh my goodness, it's crazy. Look at that. Can I throw
Ah,
one thing out there about Raptor and Raptor testing?
yeah.
I would love to see more McGregor Raptor test photos, and I'm just saying I have a lot of free time if the right people are listening. Just throwing it out there. I've shot a lot of different engine tests before. Not trying to plug myself too hard, but I'm just throwing it out there.
Well, hey, John, if
Just
the right
saying.
people are watching, hi, James.
Hi James. Hi James. Text me, James. Please.
I'm just saying, if you're going to let a photographer in, you might want to let a live stream crew in too.
There you
Yes,
go.
please, please. Let us all in. Let us all in. This be pretty
We'll
cool.
stay 6 feet away from each other, we promise.
Yes.
Oh
But
man,
yeah,
now we're
no,
in trouble with
that's
SpaceX comms.
vacuum
It's
Raptor.
fine.
Yeah.
I'm gonna bring in some more questions. We've got a whole bunch of Starship questions, so let's see what else is here. Um, doo, doo, doo. We got a super chat here from Douglas saying good luck to all of the applicants talking about Inspiration4. Thank you and appreciate your support there. Let's see. What do you guys think the thrust section for the first Super Heavy booster will look like underneath just mounting points for 2 Raptors or more? So let's talk about some other future Starship testing. They got to test the Super Heavy booster. What are we expecting that to look like as far as number of engines, how they'll fly, what they'll do? Are they going to, what are they going to do? Any info there?
Yeah, so for the first one, for BN1, which we just actually saw a little bit earlier, live
Yeah.
views from one of DOS's robots army deployments. We
By the way,
saw
I'm
them
showing Mary photos as well, by the way, because of course, Mary
Yes,
Bogachiga. I just want to put that out there. Anyway, that's what you're seeing. Continue, Chris.
yes. So yeah, you are correct. Right, it has mounting points for 2 Raptors. Will it get 2 Raptors? I think it will. There is something to be said for maybe the first one will just be cryoproofing, propellant loading, but not actually static firing. There's something to be said for that. This is SpaceX, so plans change by the minute.
It's
Sometimes
already changed. Sorry. It's
Yeah.
Yeah, it changed by the time you started the sentence.
Exactly. Um, I think a flight on the first BN is like a hop, a 150-meter hop. I if your cryoproofing and your pressurization testing and your propellant load testing all go well, why not? I mean, as long as you've outfitted it with legs so it can land, why not? Um, but I think a lot is still up in the air, and I think maybe a lot of it is still up in the air from them as well, based on how it does in its initial test round of being proofed out at the pad and being put through its paces. Because
Do we
ultimately, ultimately, if it passes all of those things, you could get good data if you stick two Raptors on it and fly it 150 meters just on a quick translation hop, like we saw SN5 and SN6 do before they got the nose cones on Starship.
And Starhopper. Don't forget Starhopper.
Well,
You gotta
and
put some respect
Starhopper,
on
only one to
yes.
fly
Starhopper.
twice? Only one to fly twice.
True. Yes.
Is that
More to our
true?
little
Oh my
Starhopper.
gosh, it is. That's
Do we think
insane.
do we think if they land a upper stage Starship before the first BN1 test campaign starts, that they might be more? I'm kind of just throwing this out there on a whim. More or less inclined to launch a booster outside of a dedicated full stack launch,
Uh,
because
I
comparably it might be a lot easier to land a booster than it would be to land a Starship. So maybe they just go, "Hey, we're pretty confident," and they wait to fly it when there's a full stack. Just throwing it out there.
okay. Actually, I need you to repeat that because I heard two conflicting questions. I heard, would they wait to fly it with a Starship that's landed, or would they not wait to fly it with a Starship? Which one are
It's
you
sort of like
asking? Sorry.
an open ended, like, do we think them landing an upper stage Starship would steer them in either direction of not flying a booster until a full stack, or maybe doing a dedicated hop?
Okay. I got you. So
It's kind of like a pointless question because we don't know, but like it's worth debating.
well, no, but it's a worthwhile question because there's a huge operational difference between how they're flown, right? Why did they start with Starship versus the booster? Because you need the booster to get orbital, right? Starship can technically haul itself to orbit, single stage to orbit, but it's not recoverable, it's not reusable
Yes.
after that point. Um, so yeah, why would you start with it instead of the booster? The bottom line answer to that is because the Starship part is the hardest part. The reignition, the flip and burn, the belly flop maneuver, all of that is the hardest part. The booster is basically just making some software decision logic changes based on its size, the number of Raptors you're going to ignite for the landing burn. Ultimately, that booster is going to do nothing different than we have seen the Falcon 9 first stages do over 100 times by now.
Yes.
So I would actually say I don't. I think there's some stuff to be gained in terms of grounding the stability models for how just something the sheer size of the super heavy
It's
booster,
giant.
which is
Yeah.
70 meters. It is as tall as the fully stacked with a payload fairing Falcon 9 is. So that's
Yes.
first stage, second stage payload fairings. And that is literally just the height of the booster first stage
Yeah.
for the Starship system. So I do think there's some stuff to be gained in that regard of solidifying your analytical models, but I don't really see a need to do anything beyond there, primarily because just the sheer aerodynamic forces involved of going skyward, you're going to need a nose cone. And
Yeah.
Starship is your nose cone on
Yeah.
top of your booster. So I don't really see why they would end up needing to do high altitude tests of the boosters. Whereas
Yeah.
and we do see why they need to do that with the Starship system itself. It's kind of
It's
like
like the
they've
high altitude
Kerbalized
test
it,
for the
right?
booster is the full stack launch, right?
Right.
Yes, exactly,
Yes.
exactly. I
Yes.
mean, yeah, exactly. And it's kind of like if you play Kerbal, right? Like you haul stuff out to the launch pad in piecemeal and you test things piecemeal, right? Before you integrate the entire thing together. We're just seeing them play Kerbal in real life.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, you play Kerbal differently than I do. I just strap everything together and hit the button and see if it works. But maybe that's a different. Maybe that's just a different gaming strategy. I'm going to keep bringing in some more questions here and some super chats. We got a couple super chats. One from Dan. No question this time, just more for your great coverage of past and future Starship launches. Thank you so much, Dan. Here is an interesting question. Do you think the latest loss of a Falcon 9 booster with suspected engine failure could be prevented with the same fix for SN10, lighting 3 engines and dropping the worst one? I believe the answer is no, and I will answer it a little bit, and then I'll let you guys add on to it. So Falcon 9 lands with one single Merlin engine, and it's the center Merlin engine. I don't believe it can do the final touchdown at least under thrust of more than one Merlin engine.
It can,
And
but they've gone away from that completely.
yeah,
But it technically
it can technically, but it was not as reliable as they liked, so they didn't do it. So they don't want to touch down under the thrust of more than one Merlin, which means that you'd have to have an off-axis thrust. Because if that center engine is not working for any reason and you want to go to a backup engine, all of the other ones are on the outside of the vehicle, so your thrust is not going to be symmetrical. So that's not really going to work.
Yes.
So they cannot have that same solution for a Falcon 9 landing, right?
I think the center engine is integral to the landing for a few reasons.
Mhm.
Like you alluded to with the gimbaling, it doesn't
Right.
need to gimbal to the degree that an outer one would. And I think I'm not sure what all is known publicly, but I think there's other reasons that the center engine might be equipped a bit differently because it's the primary landing engine. I don't know if Chris could maybe add on to that.
I mean, in a lot of ways, it comes down to the dynamics of the difference between the vehicles, right?
Hmm.
Where Starship was designed from the ground up to be able to handle, um, a slight asymmetrical thrust, right? If you only ignite two of them, or since you only need two for the landing burn, but we see they're obviously going to ignite three now. Um, but again, yeah, it's not that you couldn't account for an off center thrust on the Falcon 9. It's just that's not how they designed them. And
It
and
might be
ultimately, a
so
lot of our
unexpected
questions.
that they didn't even really, maybe they didn't think to account for it, but it's just it would be so unexpected for the center one to not be there that like why devote the resources to preparing for it not to be, right?
Uh, well,
Maybe?
I don't know if it's not that so much as it is the reliability that they were baking into the system, right? I mean, like the Merlins are incredibly reliable
Interesting.
engines.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a reason why there's a reason why like last March when there was a landing failure, right? We were like, whoa, that's odd. And now this February when there was a landing failure, we were like, wow, that's surprising because the systems have gotten that good. They've gotten that
Yeah.
reliable, and
They
that's what you
expect them.
ultimately want. But to be fair too, and this is the bigger reason for the difference in the thought process logic here, right? So the Falcon 9 is aiming for a target that is offshore if it's coming into land or out to sea if it's coming into the drone ship, right? And it's only once that center Merlin reignites that it makes the final trajectory hop to align with the landing location. So that way, if you don't if it doesn't reignite, you haven't sacrificed your landing pad or impaled your drone ship. Seagulls wouldn't
Which
like
has been
that, as
done.
we saw. Which yes,
Which has
yes,
been,
which has
yeah.
been done. Yes, but the Falcon 9 is not carrying a human on board. You don't
Right.
necessarily need the added redundancy there because if you lose a booster, it might be a pain for your manifest for a couple of months. You're ultimately going to get over that once new boosters enter the rotation. Right. Whereas with Starship, what we are talking about is a system where it has to work every single time because there is no, oh, the engine didn't light. Let's just pop the parachute instead.
Yeah.
Nope. So I think it's just the different design logics, the different control regimes. But remember too, as Starship is flipping, right, it's also like protect the aero surfaces once those engines reignite. Whereas Falcon 9 is still like, I need to steer, right, coming in with its aero surfaces like the booster will be. Yeah.
All right, we are coming up on the end of our showtime. I know we could talk about Starship for hours and hours on end. Really quick, I just want to speed run these last couple super chats that come through. I know some of them have questions that we did not have time to answer. But Justin, It's Worm, Antonio, and Mark, I see your super chats, and thank you all so much for your support. And thank you to everyone who sends our super chats and membership and stuff. A big thank you to our top tier memberships. I know we have that screen that's going to come up if Michael gets the cue. It's like, there it goes. Our launch directors and flight engineers, a huge thank you to all of them as well. All of these streams are not possible without all of your support. Guys, if we did not get to your question on today, which I know there are lots of people that we didn't, just because we get so many questions and we want to offer a really good answer to all of those questions, so we talk about them for a long time and then we run out of time. Feel free to talk to us on social media, and all of our handles are on the bottom of our screen. You can find Chris Gebhardt at ChrisG_NSF, myself at TGMetsFan98, and John Kraus at John Kraus Photos. If you have questions for us that we did not get to answer, please reach out to us on social media, especially on Twitter, and we would love to answer them there. But I want to wrap up the show by just giving a big thank you to Mr. John Kraus for coming and hanging out with us and talking to us about Inspiration4, Starship, all things space. I know it was a fun time, and thanks for coming on, John.
Thank you for having me. It was a blast.
And of course, Chris, a familiar face on the show, but thank you as well for hopping on today and talking Starship with us.
My pleasure. I think we were we were a little busy before we came on air, editing 2 launch articles for overnight. It's a busy day for before everyone runs away. Just of note, we have the Amazonia 1 launch, a Brazilian satellite with 18 smallsat passengers, going on an Indian polar satellite launch vehicle just before midnight Eastern, 04:54 UTC tonight. That will be followed 2 hours later at 01:55 Eastern, 06:55 UTC by Arctica M from Russia. And then we have an EVA, a spacewalk starting outside the space station at noon UTC tomorrow, followed by a Starlink launch just after midnight. It's a busy weekend, of which NSF Live was event number 1. So yes, don't forget those launches overnight, and the EVA and launches tomorrow as well.
Absolutely. And of course, my name is Thomas Burghardt, editor and reporter for NASASpaceflight. Thank you all so much for tuning in. One last time, I'm going to give our special guest one last chance. John, if we want prints or something of rocket photos and stuff like that, where should they go and what code should they use?
So you should go to johncrossphotos.com, and at checkout, use the code NSF, all lowercase, at checkout. It will last for the next day or so, and it will save you 20% off your entire order. And I want to extend a quick thank you to, it looks like there's already almost 10 people that have placed orders. That is insane. Just a heartfelt thank you. It means a lot to see my work literally like end up as integral parts of people's living rooms and rooms and stuff like that. So thank you guys, and thanks for having me on again.
We have a history of breaking internet storefronts by mentioning stores on stream, so hopefully that does not
Shatter
happen to
my store.
yours.
Shatter my store, everybody.
But thank you all
guys.
so much for watching. Thank you everyone who tuned in and all of the support. We really appreciate it. Until next time, our next broadcast for NSF should be tomorrow night Starlink launch, so stay tuned for that. And until next time, this is the NSF crew and John Kraus signing off. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Pressure looks good. Following up. Roger, roll, Atlantic. Water towers fly! Flight downside speed off. Speed off.
Yikes. You bet. Sure. We don't need any more of these.